Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our business storytelling show. I'm your host, Mushin-Makedonskiy, and today with me is an amazing and very competitive human being, Matty Dix. Matt is a great storyteller and a winner of 49 Moth StorySLAMs and 6 Moth GrandSLAMs. That's a competition for all of you guys who don't know about it. It's a competition where storytellers come head to head and compete whose story is better and who is better at it. So Matt is also an author of StoryWorthy, an amazing book which has a lot of practices. I will get the link in the description. Matt, it's a pleasure to have you here. I'm just can't wait to start talking with you about competitive storytelling and stories.
It's an honor to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. I really enjoyed your book, and I told quite a number of people here that it's great. And even though the Russian market is lacking in terms of good books, people went out and wrote yours. And I have several questions from the fans, and I would love to start with one of them. Here it goes. Were you born with storytelling talent, or have you developed it? And if it's the later, please be the later. What moved you to actually develop it in the first place?
Well, the good news is I wasn't born with it. I have turned terrible storytellers into excellent storytellers in short periods of time. So it's a craft. It's a bit of an art, but it's very much a craft that can be learned. For me, I started taking it seriously in 2011 when I started taking the stage and performing, but I was admittedly pretty good at it right off the bat. And I used to tell people, I'd say in workshops, I just stumbled upon something I was naturally good at later in life. And one day my wife heard me say that. And she said, "Is that really what you're telling people?" And I said, "Well, yeah. It's not like I studied the craft and I started winning right away." And my wife pointed out to me a bunch of things. She pointed out to me that I'm an author. I'm a novelist, and I've been writing every single day of my life since I was 17 years old. So I'm very invested in story on a natural level. Even like at the age of 10, I wrote a letter to Steven Spielberg telling him that I loved his movies, but he always made a couple mistakes in every film. And I wanted him to send me the movie before he released it so that I could fix his films for him. I was sort of obsessed with storytelling. I've also been a wedding DJ for the last 22 years. So on Saturday nights, I stand in front of 300 strangers and speak to them in a microphone. And that turns out to be really helpful when you want to perform stories and feel comfortable in front of an audience. I've been an elementary school teacher for 22 years. So every day until COVID, I stand in front of students, the worst audience in the world, 10-year-old kids, and hold their attention all the time. And so all of that sort of coalesced for me in a way, and I also think that early on, for whatever reason, as a kid, I fundamentally understood that one of the best ways for me to get attention from adults and from girls was to share the most embarrassing, shameful, and ridiculous things that I did. So while my friends were sort of trying to impress girls with home runs and, fancy cars and good looks, I would just tell them about the stupid thing I did at the pharmacy the day before. And it turned out that it worked. And so, it was just a way that I managed to start finding my way through life. So all of that sort of came together for me. But when I think about the first story I told in 2011 versus who I am today, I am vastly different in terms of my craft because I have applied myself to the craft. So it's not something you're born with. I grew up in a home with parents who basically didn't pay a lot of attention to us. They were always in the other room through a cloud of secondhand smoke, talking to themselves. I didn't have a lot of parental support growing up. So it wasn't like I grew up in a family of storytellers. It really was something I've developed over time, and everyone can do it.
Wow. That's tough, and at the same point enlightening. Like, you can do it even if you didn't have any prerequisites to it. That's great.
Yeah.
you've mentioned this thing that you share your vulnerable moment, and I know it works great on stage, and sometimes it really does also work in business storytelling, like when you go in a meeting or some kind of this. But here's the question that it really also came from a fan. Um, there should be some borders, like something really good, it works on stage really good, like being vulnerable, and at the same time being vulnerable in business also works good. But I guess some techniques or instruments, they work only on stage, or like should not be applied to business, and vice versa. Maybe can you share some of them that are like only for stage or only for business in your experience?
I think the only difference is that when you're on stage, you're able to sort of be indulgent. You can just talk about yourself for the sake of talking about yourself.
Hmm.
And everyone is completely fine with that. You don't sort of need a purpose. You don't need to be driving towards a point. When you're in business, whenever you're standing in front of a boardroom or a sales conference or your boss in an interview, any of those things, you can't afford to just be talking about yourself for the sake of sharing yourself. You sort of have to have a bend to it. There has to be a reason why this story is coming. That isn't to say that you can't tell a story and really have people, sort of your customers, your clients, your business partners, wondering for a little bit, why is he telling me this? In fact, that's a fantastic thing to be able to do. Why is he telling me this? And when you reach the end of the story, it becomes clear that the story applies exactly to the problem that you're dealing with or the product you're trying to sell. So in business, I think all of the same storytelling practices and all of the same craft applies, but you have to make sure that the story and the purpose for that business interaction, that they're married in some way. And sometimes it's obvious. I worked with the CEO of Yale New Haven Hospital, and she told a story on stage at a big conference about how her husband had knee surgery in her own hospital and how they botched the surgery, how it was a bad surgery. And that's a very vulnerable thing for a CEO to get up and say, my people messed up my husband's knee. And what happened for her is the next day, she suddenly found that her employees and her people were more connected to her and more willing to share and feeling more excited about having her as a leader because she was so vulnerable. So there was a purpose to the story. It wasn't just an indulgent story. But I think you can do it even with stories that sort of don't necessarily fit automatically. I did a keynote address at a human trafficking conference years ago. And they asked me before I took the stage, they said, how much researching did you do on human trafficking? And I said, oh, none. I'm not going to talk about human trafficking. Like, you're going to spend 3 days talking about human trafficking, but don't worry. And I ended up telling a story about how when I was a teacher, I sort of ignored shy kids for a long time, thinking that they were just going to be shy for the rest of their lives. And then one day a girl showed me that, no, you can actually help shy kids too. You don't have to ignore them. And it occurred to me that I had ignored so many kids for so long, and that was a mistake. And I tied it into human trafficking. I tied it into the importance of you can't afford to wait and have someone teach you that you're failing, especially when you're dealing with something like human trafficking. You need to be immediately solving problems and not sort of letting people say it takes a long time to steer a big ship. No, not if it's human life on that ship. You have to steer as quickly as you can. And everyone loved it. And I never talked about human trafficking. I tied the story of my life into the purpose for the conference. So as long as that's happening, I think all storytelling strategies and craft and methods apply in all places.
Oh, I just love it. This part where the story is told for not for something, just for fun, or just, oh, I had an episode, and so what? And
Right.
it really gets messed up. Just a question that is coming up from what you've said. In business, sometimes the story is already available, like the one you've had treating the shy kids. So the purpose came after the story was already there. It's a very natural method, given your amazing trick on the homework for life. And I know it is, but can it be another way around? Because I really, a lot of the time people come to me and say, like, Artem, I have a sales call, I need a story to be successful for the sales call. but I know that the purpose is not to be successful on the sales call. That's just the goal. So can you share some insight in this matter?
What I always think about is, can I be successful on the sales call? I would say sort of what is going to be required to be successful on the sales call. And what I'm looking for is sort of a theme or an emotion of some kind. Am I going to need to get my client excited? Am I going to do I need to convince my client of something that they don't already believe? Do I need to bring my client from a low point where they're dealing with problems to a high point where I can offer them solutions to those problems? Do I need to get the client to believe in me in some way, right? Do they need to see me as someone who takes on challenges, someone who is willing to do everything it takes, all of those kinds of things? I would dig into that, because what happens is, if you're a storyteller and you're crafting lots of stories like I am, sort of creating a library of stories from which you can draw from, it doesn't ever matter anymore when someone asks me, can you come be the keynote for blank conference? It's always yes, because I always have a story that fits every situation, because I recognize that my stories aren't about the things that happened, but about the theme and the feeling and the motivation and those results. So it's so easy for me to find a story almost immediately to match any need that someone might have. So that's sort of the goal, is you can't think of it as success on a sales call, but what would what would define that success, and then find a story that matches that. And then you can do both at the same time. And I think that's the best way to do it.
Wow, great. So you get to have an emotion that you need to trigger in a person, and some kind of, a new thought order. Did I get it right?
Yeah. Well, a new thought order about something. It could be about the product. It
Yeah,
could
a
be
new
about you
idea.
as a person. Yeah, whatever it is. Yeah, you want to just match those two. And I actually believe that when you can take sort of something that is entirely unlike what you're dealing with on your sales call, but has the same theme, I think that's the most powerful way to do it. In the same way I talked about shy girls and human trafficking, those things don't typically go together.
Yeah.
And because I brought them together, I think that's actually more powerful than if I talked about something more closely adjacent to, let's say, human trafficking. I think it's when we have different ideas that we can sort of bring together thematically, that's really powerful for people.
That's interesting, because you could just use your experience and, any kind of topic that is just related in terms of emotion or ideas that you transfer in any situation. That's neat. That's great.
Yeah,
But
I do a workshop for business leaders, people who come in who are, on all types of business, and we craft up a story. But then I always tell them, because they can't see it, they always say, like, well, what can I do with this story? And I give them 8 ways to use the story, and they're always astounded with the ways that I show them that they can make use of this story in business, whether it's with clients or employees or stakeholders or investors. There's always ways to use these stories, and it is sort of the barrier that I find in business people, like that leap that takes a longer time to make, that understanding that the story you told about your son playing baseball, don't you understand how we can bend that story just a little bit and it can be inspiring to employees? Or we can bend it a little bit and we can convince customers that you're reliable, or we can bend it a little bit and we can convince investors that you're worth investing in. And they never see it until I tell them, and then it's perfectly clear to them. So, it
yeah,
is something that's hard for a lot of people to see instantaneously. It takes some practice.
that's a good one. So you need to show what your story is really about. And I love it. I recently talked to Doug Lippman, and he said that the sense of the story is living not in the mind of the teller, it's in the mind of the listener. So you
Yeah.
need to just, this feedback is very important. Okay, here's the tricky question, and I'll be back to the second line I've got. A leader telling about his son is actually something quite normal, and it should be this way because the leader should be transparent. But then at the same time, imagine if you're in sales, or like especially in B2B sales, and you are telling a story about your son, but it's not connected to the product or to anything of sort. So how do you make sure that the client doesn't go, why is it, what's the point? So is there a way
Right.
to, yeah.
Well, I mean, part of it is, the thing that I've said, which is eventually the story is going to land somehow. with the product. In situations like that, there's a couple things I tell people to do. When you tell a story, especially in business, you have to have a variety of versions of that story. So you have to have the 30-second version of the story, and you have to have the 5-minute version of the story, and you have to have the 2-minute version of the story. A lot of it does depend on sort of the person you're facing. You know, I might have an excellent 5-minute story that I can use to convince a client, let's say, to hire me as a storytelling coach. But I realize just based upon, just based upon like the way they appear, the amount of attention they're giving me, the amount of time they seem to have, I will quickly shave a 5-minute story into a 30-second story, still getting to the heart and the emotion of it. And that way, it's less likely that they're going to wonder, why is this guy telling me this? In 30 seconds, almost everyone will afford you 30 seconds. So that is a trick where you can learn to tell stories in different amounts of time. That will be very helpful. The other thing I always teach people to do, I actually do a class on this too, is I do these personal inventories with business people. It's the idea that when you meet someone, what do you want that person to know about you as quickly as possible? And what I want people to know about me is always the things that will connect me to them in some meaningful way. So I let people know as quickly as I can that I'm married, because a married person signals that another human being agreed to spend their entire life with you. And that's significant, because if I
Yeah.
meet a 55-year-old guy who's never been married before, I have to wonder, like, you're 55, you've never been married? Why? Now, there might be a perfectly good explanation, but it does seem a little weird, I let people know that I'm a parent right away, because fathers are more trustworthy than people who are not fathers. I let people know I own cats almost as quickly as possible, because if you own a cat and I own a cat, we have so much mutual ground, and it just makes me feel like someone that they can more closely relate to. I let people know I'm an elementary school teacher, because that's a noble profession, and it's the kind of thing that makes me feel safe, makes me feel reliable, you know. So I do these inventories with people where we sort of inventory all the things that they might want to get out into the conversation as quickly as possible, and then finding ways to do it through story. Sometimes I'm talking about a 1-sentence story. Sometimes it's a 3-sentence story. I can't just sort of come out and say, hi, I'm Matt, I'm a school teacher, a father, I'm married, I have 2 cats, right? That doesn't make any
Yeah,
sense.
that's
You can weave these things in. You can actually train yourself to weave these moments in that feel natural, that cause people to go, oh, you're a cat owner, you know? Oh,
yeah.
you're a teacher. And so I teach people how to do that. And what happens is, as soon as someone feels connected to you, they will afford you more time, they will afford you more attention, and they will afford you more sort of respect and trustworthiness. And all of that is really helpful in business.
Okay, at that point, I just need to ask you for an example. Can you just exemplify how you weave in those things, to sound like a story, to be a story?
Well, the first thing is, I'll tell you, and everyone sort of nods about this, but doesn't actually do it. You have to be a great listener. I am always, in every meeting, every Zoom call, every encounter I'm in, I attempt to be the last person to speak at all times. Part of is that because I'm a white guy, I'm a white, straight, cisgender man who has every advantage in the world. So I don't need to be the first one to speak, but I am tactically absorbing information so that when it comes time for me to speak, I have a better lay of the land. It also allows me to respond to people rather than being forthright with my information. So that if I want to get out the fact that I'm a teacher, for example, right? There's ways where I can sort of weave that in. I might just say something about my schedule. I might just say, well, unfortunately, Monday through Friday, I'm teaching, I'm in the classroom. And they'll say the classroom. And I'll say, yeah, I'm actually an elementary school teacher. I always make sure it's that. I don't want them to think of me as a college professor. I want them to know I work with little children. But more often, I teach people that if you just listen to someone talking and someone brings up their kids, for example, if suddenly they mention their kid, I say, oh, what grade is your child in? And they'll say, oh, my child's in 8th grade. And then I'll say, oh, I teach 5th grade. And now it feels natural. Like, it doesn't feel like I was
Yeah,
forcing
it
that
gives it
idea through.
context.
Yeah. So often the way I manage to do that is I allow people to speak and I wait for my opportunity to strike. Just that little window that they open where I can slide in and give them a bit of information. Sometimes it's simple things like the cat, right? Like like our interview today, right? We started talking this morning before we started the interview. I told you a little story about my cat getting out 4 days ago and interfering with another interview. Now, I'm not sort of looking to do business with you and get you to buy my products, but I do things like that all the time. I'll say, oh, well, it was a rough morning. They'll say, how was your day? And I'll say, well, it was a tricky morning because my cat managed to knock over 13 things in my house today. And that's just my way of responding to a question. Instead of saying, I'm fine, I instead think, instead of saying fine, what am I going to say that lets people know something about me? So if you ask
That's
me,
good.
how's my day? It's going to be my kid, my wife, my cat, my students. I'm always going to respond in some way like that rather than the simple answer. It's an opportunity to share something. So I always do that.
Wow. I mean, every cue is a cue. It's not just, an obligatory what's up statement.
I
Wow,
try
that's
to
good.
I try to answer every question I am asked with a story, whether that is a one-sentence story about my cats knocking everything over, or a 3-minute story about something significant that happened in my life that's moving and meaningful and funny.
Wow, that's good. That's a good practice. I really should advise people to try it. Thank you. You've had a lot of these, life hacks, the methods. The book is really crammed with them, and the stories, of course. But what I absolutely loved is the 5 methods of how you can raise the stakes. Those were just brilliant, and I love the names also. But let me just run a little further. Maybe you have some kind of insight or a method that you've come up with recently, and you're using it in the training. Can you share an insight of a method that is like packed and ready to use like those?
You mean sort of like a new
Yeah,
strategy?
something that you've come up with. I don't mean to overrun your training, because if
Oh, no,
not to be commercial.
sure. A thing that I don't think I talk about enough in the book, I'm writing another book because of all the content that I haven't gotten to. Uh, I've been talking a lot about the amount of description that people contain within stories. Actually, not the amount of description, but the choices they make when they choose to describe. So often I get people telling me that my stories are incredibly evocative. They ask me, how do you make it seem so real in my mind? And the truth is, I use almost no adjectives in any of my stories. I aggressively don't describe things. Instead, what I believe in is a good hard noun. I love nouns a great deal. What I understand is that the human imagination is going to always be more powerful than the words that I can convey. And so if I can allow my listener to create the images for me by me just offering one noun, that is better than me describing a lot of things. So, for example, if I told you yesterday, my family went down to the beach. At that point, now that I've used the word beach, you know what your sort of platonic version of a beach looks like. You put a picture in your head of what the beach looks like, right? Everyone will
Exactly.
do that. I'll say my family and I are sitting on a blanket on the beach, and now you construct the beach for me. You do a million other things that you don't even realize you have just done by constructing the beach. You have decided whether it's an ocean or a freshwater situation, whether there's waves or not. You pick the weather for the day without even knowing it. You put me probably in a sunny day, but you may have put,
Exactly.
right, you may have put clouds, you may have not, right? You actually created a horizon. You separated land and sea and sky without me having to tell you that. You might have put sort of a hot dog snack shack, or maybe not. Maybe you put me sort of in like one of these wilderness beaches far off from everybody else in the world. Maybe you put lots of people on the beach. Maybe you put just my family on the beach. All of those things you already did for me. As a storyteller, I ask myself, is any of that relevant? Do I care about the picture of the beach, that Tim just put in his head? Most of the time, I don't. Most of the time, the picture is irrelevant. If the actual specifics of my beach are not relevant to my story, right? If it doesn't really matter, I let it stand in your mind as it is. And now you have a complete version of a beach. And somehow you give me credit for putting that picture in your head, when really it's just a picture that I have managed to access. Probably a beach you've been on in your life or a beach you've seen on television. And it's so complete. Also, by not trying to describe the beach I was on, I don't mentally tax you in any way. Because as soon as we start sort of assembling locations and assembling descriptions for people, they have to start like putting all that stuff together in their head and then holding it in their head, right? So sometimes that will be important, but almost never. Honestly, it's almost never. That goes for people too. You know, I meet someone in the grocery store and I get in a fight with that person and I want to describe that person. The only thing I really want you to do is to picture someone in your head about the same age and the same gender. That's really all I'm almost always looking for. So I might just say an older woman, a little shorter than me with a scratchy voice, right? Everything else that I could have used to describe her disappears from my description. I allow you to fill in the rest, and suddenly she's a fully realized character in your mind. You don't realize I've only given you 2 things to think about. I've given you 2 specific details, and you used that to fill in the rest. Comic book writers have actually discovered this too. Comic book writers have discovered that the fewer facial features they put on their characters, the more connected and the more an audience likes those characters, the more they remember those characters. The comic book characters that have those fully fleshed out faces tend to be characters that audiences or readers don't like, don't feel connected to, and don't remember as well. Because when you have a simple face with just a few images on it, you fill in the rest in your head. That person gets to become the person you want them to be, not the person who the illustrator is forcing them to be. So
That's
I have been
good.
spending a lot of time talking to people about the idea that a simple noun can work enormous amounts of energy for you. Seasons are a good example. I love starting stories by saying it's the winter of 2003. Because if that just, the word winter carries hundreds of bits of information with it. And I don't even have to tell you there's snow on the ground, because if I say it's a winter of 2003, you put snow on the ground for me, right? There's no way you didn't do it. And even if you didn't, if there's no need for snow on the ground, I'm moving forward anyway. So less is more, and the power of the imagination is always going to be more powerful than words. And so I've been focusing on that quite a bit with people lately.
That's good. That's good. So if I get it, if I get it right, you don't need to be descriptive. You just use nouns, and it places a symbol, a vision in the head. That's awesome. That really saves the resources of the brain to experience the story itself. But here's the question, just to add up: are there any situations where you need to be sure, on stage or in business, it doesn't matter, that you've set up the right image, not
Oh
just
yeah.
some kind of image?
Yes, absolutely. You know, I just told a story a few days ago about being on the MIT campus. And I was in the restroom of the MIT campus. It's a story about me saying something stupid to a professor accidentally and managing to get myself out of that problem. But the story takes place in the men's room. And I'm using a urinal. And there's 8 urinals. And I am at urinal number 2. And then someone comes up and uses urinal number 3, even though there's all these other urinals. And as a man, you know that there's sort of urinal etiquette. Like you have no problem using a urinal next to someone else, but if you can space yourself out, that's what you do. And this guy didn't do it. And I have to be clear about the physical nature of this space, because later on, you know, I sort of wonder, like, who's this loser who doesn't understand basic urinal etiquette? You know, why am I using number 2 and he's using number 3 when he could have used 4, 5, 6, 7, or 8, right? And I go back to the workshop that I'm teaching, and I tell the class, I go, you're not going to believe what just happened to me. I'm using this urinal, and then some weirdo to my right, and I'm using 2, and he uses number 3. Like, who does that? And it's a professor who's in my workshop, who he says, actually, that was me. And I'm like, oh God, I've just ruined everything. And thankfully he goes, no, I was thinking the same thing. He said, I had all your teaching in my head. I walk into the bathroom, I use urinal number 3, and I go, oh my God, what am I doing? Why am I right next to? And then he looks and he realizes it's me. And he's like, oh my God, what have I done? So he has sort of the same moment that I'm having, and it works out okay. We end up actually as friends. We're friends to this day. But in that case, I have to be really specific about the location, because it doesn't make sense without it. So you just ask yourself, the difference is some people feel the need for their audience to see what really happened. I tell people, the audience doesn't really want to see what actually happened. The audience wants to see the best version of your story. They want to be entertained. And the best way to entertain someone is allow them to put their own beach in your story, rather than making sure that they see exactly your beach. Nobody cares about your exact beach, but there are human beings who feel like, but I want them to know my truth. And I'm always like, well, the beach isn't your truth. The truth is what's going to happen in your head when you reach the end of this story and you share the thing that changed fundamentally about you as a person or the way you think. The physical location and the stuff around you is not truth. It's just clutter that you have to get through to get to the good stuff.
That's good. Thank you for clarifying, because yeah, I thought you would become friends with this guy, because that's an experience. You either go as enemies or friends. And yeah, that's a hell of a story. I mean, the whole part of it, not just, the episode in the bathroom. I feel that when you're doing it, or when a professional storyteller does it, it feels like, something natural. You basically just told me a story of how you've been to the men's room. That's so easy and so on the ground. It's like, just look. But a lot of people still don't do it. And the question I would like to ask you is, what is in your mind the main barrier that stops people from entirely noticing and telling the stories whatsoever?
I think what happens is that people see stories as stuff that happens in our life, and it requires action and adventure and suspense. The thing I sort of love about storytelling, the thing I love about so many of the stories I tell, is that if you were an outside observer, some of my most profound stories, if you were watching me in the midst of that story, you wouldn't even know that I was in the middle of a story, because so often the things that are important happen in our heads. And people discount that as being important. They think like, if nothing crazy happened, I don't really have a story. When really, none of that matters. It's really what happens in your mind. The other day, I went to play golf with my son, and he sat down on a bench while I was paying for the golf. And when I came back to him, he was looking at this plaque on the bench. There was this gold plaque. It was a memorial plaque. It said, "In memorial for Bob Smith and his birth and death date." And my son, who's 8, Charlie, he said, "What's memorial mean?" And I said, "Oh, memorial, this is a memorial bench. Bob passed away. He probably loved playing golf here. These people put this bench here to remember Bob." And Charlie says, "Oh, when you die, I'm going to build a fountain for you, a memorial fountain. And when mommy dies, I'm going to put a fountain right next to yours because you're married, so you'll both have memorial fountains. And then when people throw pennies in the fountain, you can grant them wishes from the dead." And it's a story I'm going to tell, because I have all these things happen to me as Charlie's talking to me. First, it's really sweet that he's going to build me a memorial fountain. And then it's a little disturbing that he's already contemplating my death. I'm not even 50 and he's already thinking about my death. And then I'm a little annoyed that he's going to give me a job after I'm dead. Like, he's already lined up work for me, right? But then the real moment I have, and it's all happening right there at the bench, I realize that I'm probably never going to get a fountain. That boys and girls, little kids, have these dreams, realistic, beautiful, completely achievable dreams, that when you become an adult, you just fail to follow through on. Even though you could completely follow through on it and it would be a lovely thing, you move on to other things and you almost leave the whimsy behind. So every year I eat ice cream for breakfast twice over the course of the year, because when I was a kid, I used to say, if I was an adult, I'd eat ice cream for breakfast every day. Now I don't. I had an Egg McMuffin this morning, but I have ice cream twice a year as a reminder to myself that when I was a kid, I thought this would be amazing, and it kind of is. I recognize I can't do it every day, but I try to do it. But there's a million things I can think of as a kid that I wanted to do that I could do today and would really be happy doing, and yet I don't do them. I always wanted a Toyota 4x4. Growing up as a kid, I was like, I want a Toyota 4x4. Someday I'm going to have one. I am perfectly capable at this point in my life to buy myself a Toyota 4x4. And I would actually really like to have one. And yet I drive a Hyundai Tucson, and I'm probably never going to get a Toyota 4x4. Like, the whimsy of my childhood has left me to a certain degree. And all of that happens at a bench with my son, and the guy who I had just given the money for the golf, he's watching us and he has no idea that I'm in the midst of a profound story that I will tell on stage someday. because so many times the stories that we experience look like nothing to the outside observer. But people are obsessed with the idea that if it doesn't look like something, if it doesn't look like a movie and the way movies look like movies, then it's not really a story anyone wants to hear. Where I would argue that what I just told you, when I really craft that up, it's going to mean a lot more to people than a lot of the nonsense people think are stories, which is like crazy drinking nights out and car accidents and, you know, bike flips and things like this. So that's the barrier I think people have. They don't understand that the most profound things just happen inside our heads and are completely invisible to the rest of the world.
Wow. I really had a laugh and a moment of awe in this memory you've shared. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Well, it's an emotional journey. I had an
Yeah.
emotional journey over the course of 10 seconds. Now my goal is to just bring my audience on the same emotional journey.
Yeah, and just to do it, you craft it up. And what I really like about your book is the two things that you've mentioned, actually, that it doesn't have to be Hollywood. And the best things about the most scariest of your stories, like the one with "This is going to suck." It's not about the crash. It's about the things that happened. It was amazing. It was really amazing. And what I like about it is that you need to be just conscious about those events. But here's the tricky question and tricky thing. I've been doing the homework for life for about like 4 or 5 months now, even though this whole isolation it's still working. But sometimes I feel that like what you've shared with me right now is a really deep form of self-perception and reflection. I wouldn't even think of some things that you've pointed out, but when you say, I was like, oh my God, this is so profound and obvious. So can you give me a notch in how do you develop this level of perception of your life to be able to perceive the stories where there are none, actually, like from an
So
outside point of view?
yeah, there's a bunch of things that I do. I mean, one of the things I tell people is storytellers tend to be self-centered people to a certain degree. We tend to spend a lot of time thinking about ourselves, which is not a terrible thing. I meet many people, especially women, who spend so much of their life thinking about everyone else but themselves. And then they come to my workshops and they tell me they have no stories because they've spent their entire life thinking about their spouse and their kids and never sitting down and thinking about themselves. I can make women cry all the time when I tell them that. And then we open them up and they find they have stories. You know, there's questions I ask myself all the time. One of them is I ask myself, why do you do the things that you do? And I promise you, if you start to be just a little observant about your life, you'll discover that you do things that are sort of just strange, odd, a little different, unique, sometimes even ordinary. And when I notice those things, I always ask myself, why do you do that thing? And so often I find a story hidden behind it. Now, it might be a tiny story. You know, one of the things I do is a recent one was I was balling up my socks. They came out of the wash. I balled them up. My wife taught me to ball up my socks. And it occurred to me, I used to not ball up my socks. I used to put them together and fold them because my mother told me that people who ball up socks ruin their socks because they fall apart quicker, right? And my wife told me, no, ball up your socks, they're easier to manage. And I said to myself, well, why do I do the things that I do? Why did I used to do one thing, but now I do another? And it occurred to me, my mom, when I was growing up, understood that socks, while seemingly cheap to the rest of the world, were precious to people who had no money. And I realized as a kid, I had socks that I kept for years. Like I remember specifically a pair of socks that I probably wore for 6 years. I now switch over my socks probably every 6 months. I buy a new pair of socks. And it's that interesting change in my financial status has changed the way I value socks. At one time, they were precious, and now they're a simple commodity that can be replaced at any time. I don't know if that's a story, but can you feel how while I was folding my clothes, I asked myself, why do you do the things that you do? And I sort of uncovered something about my past. I remembered those white socks with the red stripes around them that I wore for years and years. Like all of that came back to me. The recognition that I'm doing better today than my mom ever did. I can just throw socks away and buy new socks, which was sort of unheard of. You know, I grew up without mittens. I used to wear the old socks as mittens on my hands, all of that kind of stuff. all of that happens to me because I asked that question. But then there's weird things you do, like when I'm walking down hallways, I always get as close to the corner as possible when I turn. And I remember in school one day saying, why do you do the things you do? Why are you trying to get as close to the corner as possible? Why are you cutting the corner when you're just going to pick up your kids at music? And it occurred to me, I said, well, basically, I just want to beat everyone in life. And I feel like if I can save myself even one step, at some point in the day, all of these steps will add up and I will be ahead of someone, either physically or professionally, because I saved fractions of seconds of time that will pile up for me. And I actually believe that's kind of true. Again, not maybe a story, but a realization about myself by being willing to ask myself, why do you do the things that you do? So it's observing the behavior, being observant, which we can all do. We can all observe our own behavior and say, that's kind of a different thing. But then asking yourself and allowing yourself the time to probe it. It might take, the sock happened to me instantaneously. But some of the things I ask myself about, it might take me a week before I finally figure out, oh, that's why you do that, right? Oh, that's why this movie makes you cry. That's a great question, is why does this movie make me cry? If you have a movie that gets you teary-eyed at the end, it's the best time to say, why is this movie making me cry? There's no question why the movie Field of Dreams makes me cry, because I never played catch with my father. My father left me before I ever played a game of catch, and I miss him terribly, in the same way that that character in that movie has the very same experience. And so it's a movie I can't get through. I figured that one out right away. That was as clear as day. But there's lots of movies that make me cry at the end, and I go, why am I getting so upset about this? Or why does this mean so much to me? Have you seen the Avengers movies? The Marvel
Yeah.
Avengers movie?
No, I haven't, of course.
Well, I
Yeah.
hadn't seen them for a long time. I didn't see them till the pandemic. I hadn't watched any of them. And then during the pandemic, we're in it now, we started watching them all in order. We watched every single one in order. And one of the Avengers movies has a moment where I think it's the first Avengers movie. They're in New York City. The Hulk shows up. He's Bruce Banner at the time. And
Yeah.
they're like suit up, and he turns to face the giant thing coming at them. And Captain America says, like, this is a moment when you should get angry. And I think it's the emotional catharsis of the entire Avengers franchises. He turns and he says, that's my secret, Cap. I'm always angry, right? I turned to my wife, and I almost have tears in my eyes. And I just knew that meant something to me. And I thought about it for days, and I realized, oh, that's actually exactly me. I am Bruce Banner. I am always angry about things that have happened to me in the past and things that are happening in the world. I have a level of anger that I don't think anyone understands. The only difference is I don't have a Hulk to let it out. I hold it in like Bruce Banner. And like, I had tears in my eyes in the middle of an Avengers movie while they're fighting aliens in New York City. And I asked myself why. And 3 days later, I figure it out. I go, I am filled with rage all the time. And I just don't express it because I'm not the Hulk. Like, all of those, it happens to me all the time. The willingness to acknowledge your emotions and ask yourself questions. That is a long answer to your question. I apologize, but that's
No,
how I do
that's a great answer to my question. That's what I like to hear in this show. Really. Wow. I just, while you were reflecting, I just remembered a movie that really made me cry, and and I'm going to think about the both of them. It's actually The Boyfriend from the Future, the movie where the guy time travels back, and his father actually has the same ability, and it's like in the male line of the family.
I
I don't
saw
know.
that movie. Yes.
I was so teared up because I also don't know the father, because I just don't know him anyway, and I just got so carried away by that. He accepted his life, and he just moved aside with this amazing ability. But I
Right.
was like, oh my god, this
Yeah.
is a great way to be conscious. And I think that storytelling is actually about being conscious about life. That's a great way to do it.
I always tell people that even if you're not going to be a storyteller, you should be practicing homework for life in a lot of the strategies I teach, because even if you don't want to tell people about it, the awareness that you find about yourself makes your own life feel larger, wider, and more complete. I
Yeah.
think we often go through our lives with every day blending into the next and wondering where days and weeks and months go by. But if you're doing what I'm doing, what I'm describing, it's not an Avengers movie anymore. It's a movie where you're
Yeah.
questioning a moment for the rest of your life, and you're wondering, that moment hangs on me all the time. And so many movies, so many books have these effects on me because I'm desperately looking for those connections and figuring out what they mean to me. And the same thing with when Charlie says something to me. There's nothing different between Bruce Banner saying, "My secret cap is I'm always angry," and Charlie saying, "I'm going to build a memorial fountain for you." The two things are the same. They hit me, and I just allow myself to reflect upon, why is this striking my head and heart, right? The same thing, whether it's a son or a movie, it's all the same.
Wow, that's good. Why is it so striking, and why do I do the things I do? Those questions that I get out of this conversation for sure. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Matt, there are two obligatory questions that I ask all the storytellers I face, and those are just for desserts. So the
Yeah.
first one would be like this one. What would be your advice for people who want to develop their storytelling skills, but they are only beginning their journey?
Well, Homework for Life, which you've referenced, which we don't have time to go into fully, but that would be the best thing to do to start. I think that the best storytellers in the world are the people who have the most stories to tell. And I think that Homework for Life teaches you the right stories to tell. A lot of people are telling the wrong stories. Sometimes they're telling the wrong stories well, and I would rather hear the right story told poorly. I would rather have you tell me something that really means something to you rather than the stories that people seem to be enamored with, which are the fluff and the meaningless things that don't actually change us fundamentally as people. So I would do that. And if you don't know what Homework for Life is, they can just Google the phrase Homework for Life and find my TED Talk and get a whole description on it, or get my book. Chapter 3 deals with it. So I think that would be really important. The other thing is super obvious, but again, I'll say it again. Being a listener is the most important thing. I went to college in an all women's school. And so I was the only man at that school. It taught me to be a listener. I quickly realized that these ladies do not want to hear the white guy in their class of 20 women talking all the time. And now, as an elementary school teacher, I work with 90% women, 10% men. I am almost always in a room with just women. And women have taught me to listen so well. And through that listening, I am a better storyteller. By listening to other people's stories, I find my own stories. By listening to other people's stories, I start to understand why I'm connecting to other human beings. And when you offer the floor to people, when you open space for them to share a story, they will afford you the same luxury. Because a lot of times we have to tell stories to people, and we have to find people willing to hear our stories. And the worst people are the people who love us. Because anyone who loves you will afford you all the time to tell the bad stories that you want. That's the trick. Is so often we spend our lives telling our stories to the people who love us the most, but they're terrible audiences because they have infinite patience. We want to find people who don't really know us. Strangers will tell us whether we're entertaining, not our friends and family. So opening up a space where people get to tell stories to you will afford you the same luxury. So all of that, I think, will be helpful.
Oh, those are great advice. And about the telling to the stranger, that's also great because there is
Yeah.
a risk to being offended or, being open to much vulnerability or in a story, but you get the essence of the story quick. And yeah, that's great. Thank you. That's a great advice. All right. The last question, my favorite question. I want you to finish a phrase I made up. It goes like
Okay.
this. If it took one thing to get from a good story to a great story, that one thing would be.
Surprise. I think that when you can surprise your audience, it is the most delightful thing that you can do for them. It's a joyous feeling. Every single story contains at least one surprise. At least at the end, there's always a surprise. Because if you're telling a story about transformation or realization, change, the change that happens always surprises us too. When Charlie tells me about the bench and I realize I'm never going to get a water fountain, that's a surprise to me. It's a sudden realization that, oh my God, little boys have great dreams that never follow through, right? So that's a surprise for me. Because it's a surprise for me, I should craft it in such a way that it is a surprise for my audience too. But oftentimes stories contain tons of surprises that people run over, waste, ruin, fail to recognize. And that is, I think, the difference between that was a nice story versus that was a genuinely entertaining story that moved me. When it comes to moving people emotionally, we can only really do it in storytelling through surprise. In real life, I can win, I can win my wife over by day after day, week after week, telling her how much I love her and lavishing her with my attention. And I can eventually cause her to love me, perhaps. If there's someone at work who I hate, I can every day tell them how much I hate them and how stupid they are. And eventually I might be able to break them, right? I may cause them to cry after a while, but in storytelling, we don't have that kind of time. So the way that we make people react emotionally is through surprise, by allowing them to experience these things in the same way we experience them. And so when you learn how to surprise an audience, then you can entertain an audience and really move them emotionally. It's a very
Wow,
hard thing to do.
that's a good one. Thank you, Matt. Thank you so much. Those have been a really pleasant minutes, and I really feel somehow more reflective about storytelling. And thank you so much for carrying this practice not as an art form, but more as a self-conscious mode of living your life more fully. And I really appreciate it. And that was a surprise for me. That was a surprise that I carried before reading your book. I thought, okay, now I'm going to learn something about going on stage. But after reading it and after talking to you, I feel like I'm learning something about my life. So thank you so much. That's a real pleasure, man.
Thank you. That makes my day. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.